Outside, the air of April 1843 meets you with a damp stillness that carries the weight of the whole Conestoga Valley. The grass under your boots is heavy with dew, each blade bent into a silver curve. You walk not toward the barn directly, but pause at the edge of the garden, letting the grey chill settle against your cheeks, your breath rising in a thin cloud that mingles with the low mist hanging over the creek bottom. The path to the long stone barn is worn smooth by 100 mornings like this one, a faint ribbon of bare earth leading past the split-rail fence where a single cow lifts its head and lows once, a sound so low and drawn out that it seems to belong to the darkness itself. You pass the cow and the dark shape of the hayrick and approach the barn's sliding door. The barn is built of fieldstone laid in even courses, its walls thick enough to hold the coolness of the earth long after the sun climbs. You place both hands on the wooden rail of the door and lean your weight into the slide. The door rolls sideways with a low rumble that vibrates through your palms, and the air that washes out carries the scent of old hay stacked in the loft, the nutty sharpness of linseed oil, and the unmistakable cool metal tang of iron waiting in the shadows. You step inside and leave the door open just wide enough for the coming dawn to find its way in, a sliver of sky toning from black to charcoal behind you. The Conestoga Wagon stands in the center of the barn floor like a ship berthed in a quiet harbor. Even in the half-dark you can feel its size before you can fully see it. The way the space of the barn seems to bend around its bulk. The big rear wheels rise taller than a man, their curved fellows carrying a broad iron tire that catches the faint light from the doorway in a series of dull gleams. The front wheels are smaller but equally solid, their spokes radiating from a hub the size of a barrel head. The wagon bed curves high at both ends, and the canvas cover is not yet raised, leaving the ribs bare against the rafters. For a long moment, you simply stand and look, breathing the April chill that still clings to the stone walls, and let your eyes trace the shape of each wheel, the arc of each iron rim, the way the metal meets the wood in a seam so tight it might have been grown rather than forged. You reach up to the hook set into a roof beam and take down the tin lantern that hangs there. The glass is cool and slightly fogged, and you work the wick upward with a slow turn of the small brass knob. A lucifer match scrapes against the rough stone of the wall, flaring with a hiss and a smell of sulphur, and you touch the flame to the oil-soaked wick until a soft yellow light spills out and pushes the shadows deeper into the corners. You hang the lantern on its hook again, adjusting the bail so the light falls across the left hind wheel, and the iron rim begins to reveal itself in detail. The dark patina of forged scale still clinging to the edges, the faint rust freckles that winter has left behind, the smooth places where the tire is already rolled over Pennsylvania Turnpike stone. You step closer and run a hand along that cold tire, your fingers traveling over the metal with the light pressure of a man who has done this enough times to let touch become a kind of listening. The iron surface is not perfectly smooth. There are tiny pits and ridges left by the hammer blows that shaped it, now worn down by miles of gravel and clay. You feel for rough spots that might catch on a rock, for hairline cracks that might widen under the strain of a mountain descent, and you find none. Only the even texture of sound metal that has held its shape through a long winter. Your hand stops at the joint where two ends of the tire meet and overlap. The rivet heads a neat row of low domes under your thumb, and you press them each in turn as if greeting old acquaintances. A soft murmur rises from your chest, a list of jobs for the day that you speak half aloud, not to remember but to give the morning its shape. Tap, listen, measure, grease. 4 words that hold 8 hours of quiet labor. 4 stations in a ritual you have followed every spring before a westward trek. The tapping will tell you if the iron still sings true. The listening will catch any note of separation between rim and phyllo. The measuring will confirm the tension fit with the thin metal gauge, and the greasing will work fresh tallow and pine tar deep into the hubs where the axles ride. You repeat the words once more under your breath. Tap, listen, measure, grease, and they blend together into a rhythm that sets your blood moving at the unhurried pace of the day ahead. Outside the barn, the first robin of the morning begins to sing. The notes come one by one, spaced far apart, as if the bird is still half asleep, and the sound is so clear and liquid that it seems to wash the edges of the dark away. You turn toward the doorway and see that the horizon beyond the creek bottom has begun to lighten. a band of pale blue-grey that grades upward into the retreating night. The mist over the water stirs with the first faint breath of a breeze, and the shapes of the bare walnut trees along the bank begin to separate from the general darkness. Their branches a delicate lace against the sky. You watch the light grow for a span of minutes without counting them, aware that the day is opening slowly and that there is no need to rush its unfolding. With the robin's song still hanging in the air, you turn back to the workbench that runs along the barn's north wall. The bench is a thick slab of oak, scarred from years of use, and on its surface lie the tools of the morning, a small ball-peen hammer with a hickory handle, dark from the oil of many hands, a stout wooden mallet carved from a single piece of dogwood, a thin metal gauge with a set of leaves no thicker than a fingernail, a leather bucket of tallow and tar grease, a tin of linseed oil, and a bundle of clean rags cut from old flour sacks. You select the hammer first, feeling its weight settle into your palm, and then the mallet, each tool fitting its own loop in the wide leather belt that you wear low on your hips. The hammer slides into place on your right, the mallet on your left, and you pull the belt tight with a tug that has been the same tug for years. You move back to the wagon and stand at the left hind wheel, the lantern light still pooling on the iron tire. The wheel is constructed of 14 spokes set into a hub of white oak, each spoke mortised into the fellow segments that make up the rim, and the whole assembly is bound by the iron tire that was heated and shrunk into place so that it grips the wood with a pressure measured in thousandths of an inch. You kneel down, the packed earth of the barn floor cool through the knees of your trousers, and you let your eyes travel along the rim once more, following it from the ground up and around, the lantern flame a steady golden star that glimmers on the metal's curve. The iron seems to hold its own quiet life, a history of forge-heat and water-quench and road dust baked into its surface, and you regard it with the patience of someone who knows that a small flaw left unchecked can become a broken wheel on a river crossing 1,000 miles from home. Your hand rests lightly on the felloe just below the tire, feeling the grain of the oak, the fine seasonal checks that have opened in the dry winter air and will close again when the spring dampness rises. You think about the wood and the iron together, a marriage of materials that has to hold through every kind of weather, from Pennsylvania rain to prairie sun to mountain frost. The thought does not bring worry. It brings only a quiet attention that settles over you like the lantern light itself, steady and contained. You give the wheel a slow quarter turn by pulling on a spoke, and the hub rotates with a subdued creak, the axle moving in its bed of old grease with a sound like a heavy sigh. The iron tire leaves a faint line in the dirt where it rolls, and the next section of rim comes into the light, waiting for its turn under your hands. The robin repeats its song, joined now by a second voice farther down the creek. The light of the barn door has shifted from grey to a soft pearl, and the mist is lifting in tattered veils. You rise from your kneeling position and brush the dust from your trousers with a slow sweep of your palm, leaving a pale handprint on the wall. The list still echoes somewhere in the back of your mind. Tap, listen, measure, grease. But for now you are content merely to stand beside the wagon, one hand resting on the cool iron tire, the other hanging loose at your side, while the day gathers itself around you. A calf bleats from the near pasture, a guinea hen calls from the farmyard, and the sounds drift in through the open door like leaves on a slow current. You close your eyes for a moment and feel the air moving across your face. The temperature just a few degrees above the chill of the iron, and you know that the spring trek west will begin soon, but not today. Today is for the wheels. The light inside the barn had changed while you stood beside the wagon, shifting from the uncertain grey that seeps through cracks to a broad pearl-white glow that spilled across the stone floor in a clean rectangle. You reached up and pinched the lantern wick, stopping the small flame with a soft hiss, and set the warm metal on the workbench where it could cool without hurry. The smell of lamp oil lingered a moment and then faded, replaced by the cooler air that moved through the open door. Now you could see the Conestoga Wagon as it truly was, not a shape assembled from shadows but a whole thing of wood and iron, its paint a faded indigo along the bedboards, its wheels huge and patient. You began at the left rear wheel again, the same one you had touched in the dark. But now the iron tire showed you all its features. It was a band forged in Jacob Brubaker's smithy over on the Millport Road during the previous autumn, a half-inch thick and 3 full inches across its flat face, the edges slightly rounded from the hammer. You remembered the smell of that shop, the sharp bite of coal smoke and the wet hiss of the quench tub. But you did not dwell on the memory. You simply noted it as part of the iron's biography. The metal carried a deep charcoal hue, darker than a gun barrel, with a fine speckling of rust freckles that the dry winter had drawn to the surface like faint cinnamon on a dark cake. None of the rust spots were deeper than a fingernail's thickness, and he ran a dry finger over them, feeling only the faintest graininess that would disappear under a rub of linseed oil. You walked slowly around to the back of the wagon, and then forward on the right side, letting your gaze travel the full circle of the tire where it sat against the felloe. The fit was tight and true, the iron gripping the wood in a continuous embrace. You noticed the places where the sections of the tire came together. Each seam was an overlap of about 4 inches. The ends tapered with a file so that the outer surface felt nearly flush, and through each overlap passed a line of 3 rivets. The rivet heads were neat half-domes, their tops river-smooth from the smith's finishing hammer, and they sat in a shallow countersink so that they would not catch on stones or stumps. You laid your thumb against the first rivet on the lower overlap and traced its outline, finding the metal cold but not unpleasant, the edges slightly raised where the hole had been punched through the hot iron months ago. You moved your thumb to the next rivet and then the next, counting without numbers, just sensing the even spacing that spoke of careful work. When you had touched all 6 rivets that held the 2 seams of this wheel's tire, you let your hand drop to the felloe itself. The wood was white oak, a dense pale ring of second-growth timber cut not far from the Susquehanna, its grain running in faint parallel lines around the curve. The dry winter had drawn a little moisture from the outer face, leaving a pattern of tiny checks that looked like the crackle on old porcelain, each one less than a thumbnail's length and shallow enough to catch the morning light without casting a shadow. They were not damage, they were simply the wood's way of breathing, and you made a mental note to rub them with a rag of linseed oil later in the day. The oil would darken the oak to a warm honey tone and quiet the checks until the spring rains sealed them again. You straightened your knees and looked at the whole wheel as a single shape, the way a painter might step back from a canvas. The lantern had shown you the iron's general health, the daylight showed you its character. There were places where the tire had worn to a polished silver along the very center of its face, the high spots burnished by countless revolutions over gravel and rutted clay, and there were other places near the edges where the forged scale still clung in patches of dark blue, black. The contrast made the rim seem alive, a record of travel already written even before the long westward miles. You had no need to consult a journal or ask another person. The wheel told you everything it had known. You knelt again, this time planting both knees on a folded grain sack to ease the pressure on the packed earth, and you closed your left eye so that you could sight along the rim toward the barn's far wall. The idea was to align your line of vision with the outermost edge of the tire, and then slowly turn your head, following the circle to see if the rim wobbled inward or outward by even the width of a straw. You moved your gaze with deliberate slowness, inching from the ground upward, the iron edge a black line against the pale stone behind it. The line stayed true, with no flat spots that would thump on a hard road and no outward bends that might scrape the wagon bed. A tiny inward dip, no bigger than a spoon's hollow, appeared near the top of the arc, but you recognized it as the natural result of a particular stone strike on the pike last fall, and knew it would roll out smoothly enough on soft earth. You made no additional note. It was just the wheel's own memory written faintly into the rim. While you were down at that level, you noticed the way the inner edge of the tire pinched against the felloe, an ever so slight shadow that proved the tension fit was holding. In the months since the tire had been heat-shrunk onto the wheel, the iron had contracted and the wood had compressed, and now the two materials clung together with a grip that required no bolts or glue, only the physics of cooling metal and the give of seasoned oak. You placed a flat palm against the side of the felloe and pushed gently, then pushed the tire itself from the opposite side, feeling that the bond was absolute. The wheel might roll for 1,000 miles without a single creak of separation. You rose from your knees and the grain sack dusting the dirt from your palms, and you walked to the open barn door for a moment. The sun had now climbed high enough to clear the orchard trees, and a long shaft of amber light fell across the pasture grass. A cart horse, a heavy sorrel mare with a flaxen mane, stood near the split-rail fence watching you. She was not impatient, only present, her large dark eyes following your movement as you stepped into the doorway. She lowered her head to the grass, pulled up a mouthful, and chewed with a slow sideways grind that seemed to measure time into small grassy beats. You watched her tail swish once, a calm metronome, and then you turned back inside knowing that the wheels were waiting and that the mare would be there all morning. The front wheels came next. You walked around to the wagon's forward end, where the tongue rested on a wooden block, and you crouched beside the left front wheel. It was smaller than the rear ones by a full foot in diameter, but it carried its own burden. The iron tire here was thinner by a fraction, only a half-inch thick, but still 3 inches across, because the same stone roads would bite it just as hard. You began your inspection in the same way, letting your gaze travel the full ring of iron, noting how the forged scale pattern differed slightly on this wheel, with longer streaks of blue-black near the valve where the smith had hammered the overlap flat. The rivets here were 4 in each seam, not 3, because the front tire had been patched once on a muddy road near Harrisburg, and the extra rivet held a small strap of iron that you had shaped yourself. You touched that strap now, recalling not the emergency, but the quiet hour of repair under a beech tree while rain dripped from the leaves. The memory was soft and distant, like a lantern seen across a foggy field. You turned the front wheel slowly by pulling on one spoke after another, the hub rotating with a low, woody murmur, and you watched the iron rim pass through the patch of sunlight on the floor. Each spoke was a straight rod of hickory, not turned on a lathe, but shaved with a draw knife, so that they were very slightly oval in cross-section, and their surfaces held the tiny ridges left by the blade. You counted them without meaning to, the number 14 settling into your mind like a familiar refrain, and you touched each spoke near the fellow to feel that the tenon was still tight in its mortise. None wiggled. The iron rim completed its rotation, and you let the wheel rest, the same patch of light now warming the iron until it gave off a faint smell like wet stones drying after rain. You knelt again to sight this rim, the same closed eye line of vision, the same slow pan from ground to top, and you found the front wheel true as well, with only a slight low spot that matched a worn brake shoe. Nothing that would matter on a prairie trail. You sat back on your heels and rested your hands on your thighs, looking at the 4 wheels together, the lantern still cooling on the bench, the horse still chewing in the pasture, the whole morning stretching ahead with the same patient rhythm. You had seen every inch of iron and every finger's length of oak, and you had found them sound. The small ball-peen hammer had been waiting on the workbench, its hickory handle dark from the oils of your palm and the palms of the man who shaped the handle before you, and you took it up now with the same casual grip you might use to lift a spoon from a kitchen drawer. The weight of the head was no more than 8 ounces, enough to strike a clear note from iron without bruising the metal or jarring the filo. You turned it over once in your hand, noticing the patina of tiny scratches on the polished face, the way the handle had worn smooth just behind the head where your thumb always rested. You held it loosely, letting it hang down at your side while you walked back to the left rear wheel, your boots making soft scuffs against the packed earth. The tapping routine was as old as the Conestoga Wagon itself, a method of listening to the wheel that carpenters and smiths had taught to their apprentices for generations. The idea was simple. A sound iron tire, tight on its wooden rim, would ring with a clear bell tone when struck, and if the iron had cracked or separated from the wood, the note would turn dull, a flat thock that told of hidden trouble. You had first learned this from a wagon builder in Ephrata when you were barely tall enough to reach the hub, and the lesson had sunk so deep that your hands knew the rhythm without any need for thought. You knelt beside the left rear wheel now, the grain sack cushioning your knees, and you raised the hammer. The first tap fell on the iron tire at a point just above the ground, about 4 inches forward of the bottom overlap. The hammer face met the metal with a soft teak, a sound so brief and clean that it seemed to vanish into the barn's high rafters without an echo, swallowed by the straw and the hay and the weathered boards. You paused, letting your ear catch the aftertone that followed, a faint high ring that hung in the air for a half-second before fading into a silence that felt full rather than empty. That ring was the voice of a good rim, and you listened to it the way a musician listens to a tuning fork, not analyzing, but simply receiving the pitch and the decay. You moved your hand 4 inches farther along the tire and tapped again. Teak, and the same clear ring answered, its note a tiny interval higher, because the iron was thicker here near the fellow's center rib. You tapped a third time, 4 inches farther still, teak, and now the tone was identical to the first, a consistency that told you the rim was of even density from forge to quench. You continued this way, tapping at intervals you measured by eye and muscle memory, each tap separated from the last by the space of a single slow breath. The sound of the hammer blended with the distant bleating of sheep up on the ridge beyond the creek, a counterpoint so soft and regular that it might have been a part of the same rhythm. Around the curve of the wheel you went, past the riveted overlap where you tapped with a little more care, striking the iron just to the side of the rivet heads so that the note would not be damped by the extra thickness of the joint. The metal there sang a slightly shorter note, clipped at the end by the mechanical stiffness of the seam, but still clear, still without the flat dead thock that would make you stop and frown. You noted this small difference without alarm, the way you might note a cloud passing the sun, but not threatening rain. You tapped onward, your body settling into a posture of slow work, your shoulders relaxed, your head tilted just a degree toward the wheel. When you had completed the full circle of the left rear tire, you sat back on your heels and let the hammer rest against your thigh. Your ears still carried a phantom of the last ring, a memory of sound that faded as gently as the mist that still clung to the distant walnut trees. You had heard no flat notes, no hollow responses, and the wheel had spoken to you in a language you trusted. You reached out and laid a flat palm against the iron, feeling its cold surface unchanged by the taps, the metal too thick and too hard to bear any mark of such light blows. The sun, now fully risen over the orchard, threw a long golden slat through the barn door and across the wheel, warming the rim just enough that you could feel a temperature difference between the illuminated upper curve and the shaded lower arc. You rose from the grain sack, stretched your legs by taking 3 slow steps toward the barn door, and looked out at the pasture. The sorrel mare had been joined by a second horse, a younger bay gelding with a white sock on his left hind foot, and the 2 animals stood nose to tail under the bare branches of a black walnut, their breath pluming in the crisp air. You watched them for a span of minutes, letting the sight of their stillness settle your own pulse, and you thought of nothing in particular except the way the morning light caught the oil-dark sheen of their coats. The hammer hung loose in your hand, a comfortable weight that you had long ceased to notice consciously. The mist in the creek bottom was lifting now, pulling away in soft tatters that revealed the green of early grass and the brown of last year's fallen leaves along the bank. A light breeze had begun to stir, the first real breeze of the day, and it carried the faint mineral smell of water and the sweeter scent of wet earth. You turned back to the wagon and walked to the right rear wheel, settling the grain sack into a new position with a nudge of your boot, then kneeling once more. You began the tapping on this wheel at the topmost point, where the iron was closest to your ear as you knelt, and the first tap produced a ring so pure and long that you let it hang in the air without moving for 3 full breaths. The pitch was a hair lower than the left wheel's note, a difference you could attribute to a tiny variation in the thickness of the oak felloe or the exact temperature of the forging, and it was of no consequence. You tapped, listened, moved 4 inches, tapped again, each teak a tiny punctuation in the quiet barn. The calves in the stone end of the barn lowed once, a rumble so deep that you felt it through the floor, and then they were silent again, and the tapping resumed its solitary rhythm. On this wheel you encountered a short section near the front seam where the ring changed character, not to a dull thock, but to a slightly quicker, drier note, as if the iron and wood were not quite as intimately married as they were elsewhere. You stopped and tapped that spot 3 more times, each strike identical in force and placement, and each time the note came back with the same quick decay. It was not a crack. You had already examined the surface in daylight and found no fissure. It was more likely a microscopic gap left by the contraction of the wood in a dry winter, a separation of perhaps 1/10,000th of an inch that would close again when the wheel rolled through the first rainstorm on the road to Pittsburgh. You made a mental note to recheck this section after greasing, but you felt no unease. The note was still clear, still a bell tone, just a little shorter, like a syllable pronounced at the end of a long sentence. You completed the right rear wheel and marked the spot on the tire with a tiny smudge of chalk from your pocket, no larger than a moth's wing, so that you would remember to touch it again later. Then you stood, shook out the grain sack, and moved to the front wheels. The left front wheel waited in the shadow of the wagon bed, its smaller diameter making it seem more compact and less imposing than its rear counterparts, but you knew that the front wheels took more punishment from ruts and stones and sudden turns, so your attention did not lessen. You knelt, the grain sack now worn thin at the center from years of such mornings, and raised the hammer. The first tap on the left front tire produced a note noticeably higher than the rear wheels had sung, the pitch climbing because the shorter arc of iron vibrated at a faster rate, a simple fact of physics that you had never put into formal words but understood in your bones. The ring was a bright silvery ping, almost bird-like, and it hung in the air with a delicate shimmer. You tapped around this wheel with the same 4-inch spacing, your body moving on autopilot, while your mind began to drift into a calm, repetitive state that was not quite meditation and not quite thought, but something between. You noticed the way the hammer handle warmed against your palm, the grain of the hickory becoming more tactile with each tap. You noticed the way the light shifted on the floor as the sun crept higher, the golden rectangle elongating toward the wagon's left front hub. You noticed the barn cat, the same grey one that had shared your breakfast biscuit in earlier days, now perched on a hay bale with its tail wrapped around its paws, watching you with half-closed eyes. The tap, listen, rhythm had become so steady that it seemed to generate its own silence around it, a bubble of calm that moved with you. You reached the overlap on the left front wheel and tapped near the 4 rivets there with extra gentleness, the hammer barely falling, because you knew that the riveted joint was already the most stressed point of the tire, and you wanted to hear the note without any force that might mask a sound. The ring was true, if slightly thinned by the extra mass of the rivets, and you accepted it. You moved on, completing the circle, and then paused to rub your eyes with the back of your free hand. The hammer had left a faint metallic scent on your skin, a clean smell like a nail pulled from old wood. The right front wheel was the last. You walked to it directly, the grain sack now abandoned because the earth here was softer, mixed with chaff and straw, and you knelt on the bare ground without discomfort. The tapping began again, the hammer rising and falling with the regularity of a pendulum. Somewhere outside, far down the Strasbourg road, a wagon passed with a jingle of trace chains, and you heard the driver's voice call out to his horse, a distant syllable that did not reach you as language, only sound. The noise faded into the east, and the barn returned to its quiet domain. On the right front wheel, you found a spot near the bottom of the arc that produced a faintly dull thump instead of a ring. You stopped immediately, the hammer frozen in midair, and you leaned your ear close to the tire. The dullness was not the dead thunk of a crack, but a softer, muted ping, as if something small and compressible had lodged between the iron and the wood. You ran your finger along the seam and found a tiny grain of grit, no larger than a mustard seed, that had worked its way into the gap. You pried it out with a broken straw from the floor, and the next tap rang as clear as all the others. You let your breath out, a slow exhalation you had not been aware of holding, and you continued the circuit. When the last tap had fallen and the last ring had faded, you set the hammer down on the wagon bed and stood with your hands on the small of your back, arching slightly to release the stiffness that came from kneeling. The tapping was complete, and the wheels had told you what you needed to know. They were sound. They sang. They would carry the wagon west. You walked to the open barn door and stood in the full sun for the first time that morning, the light warm on your face and the breeze cool at your collar, and you listened to the sheep still bleating on the ridge and the robin that had started the day still singing somewhere in the orchard. The hammer rested behind you on the blue-painted boards, its work done for now, and the barn cat had fallen asleep on the hay bale, its grey fur, ruffled by a draught you could not feel. You looked at your hands, at the faint red marks the hammer handle had left on your palm, and you flexed your fingers once, twice, and then tucked them into your coat pockets for a moment of warmth before the next task called. The hammer had been returned to the workbench, laid lengthwise beside the tin lantern that was now cool to the touch, and your hands were free to take up the next tool in the day's slow queue. You walked to the tool chest that sat against the north wall, A pine box banded with iron straps and darkened by a century's accumulation of oil and dust, and you lifted the lid on hinges that offered no squeak, only a quiet wooden thump as the lid rested against the stone. Inside, nested in a shallow tray lined with felt that had once been bottle green and was now a mossy brown, lay the metal gauge. You had bought it from a clockmaker in Lancaster City who also repaired surveyor's instruments, and he had sold it to you with the advice that it would measure a gap thinner than paper if your hand was steady enough. The gauge was a small thing, no longer than a man's thumb from knuckle to tip, with a brass body that had mellowed to the color of dried mustard and a steel leaf that pivoted outward on a tiny pin. The leaf was ground to a precise taper, its tip a mere 0.02 of an inch thick, and its heel a full 1/10 of an inch, and it was marked along its length with faint engraved numbers that told you the thickness at any point where it entered the gap. You lifted the gauge from its felt bed, closed the lid, and turned the tool over in your palm, watching the leaf catch the sunlight that now poured through the barn's east window. The brass was warm from the ambient air, and the steel leaf flickered with a tiny reflection that danced across your knuckles. You pressed the leaf out fully with your thumb, feeling the smooth resistance of the pivot, and let it snap back gently against its stop, a motion you had made 1,000 times, each time a small affirmation that the tool was ready. You fetched the slate from the bench, a rectangle of dark grey stone framed in wood, its surface smooth from scrubbing, and you selected a stub of chalk from a small clay dish. The chalk was a soft white stick that left a powdery residue on your fingers, and you rolled it once between your palms before tucking it into your vest pocket along with the gauge. The slate you carried under your arm, and you walked back to the left rear wheel, where the grain sack still lay crumpled on the floor from the tapping work. You straightened the sack with a nudge of your toe, knelt again, and settled your weight onto the familiar cushion. Measuring the tension fit of an iron tire was not a matter of haste or urgency, but of patience and a steady hand. The ideal gap between the inner face of the tire and the outer curve of the felloe was a fraction of a human hair, just enough to prove that the iron was not crushing the wood, but small enough to guarantee a grip that would hold through heat and cold. You understood this without needing to articulate it. Your fingers knew the target number as well as they knew the shape of a doorknob. The numbers you would write on the slate were simply a record, a way to confirm what your instincts already sensed. You began at the bottom of the wheel, where the tire was closest to the earth and therefore most likely to have collected moisture or grit that might have altered the fit. You held the gauge in your right hand, the brass body resting against the heel of your palm and the tip of the leaf between your thumb and forefinger, and you brought the thin steel point toward the seam where iron met wood. The leaf entered the gap with a faint whisper, a sound so slight that it could only be heard if you leaned your ear close, and you felt the resistance as the taper slid into place. The leaf stopped when the metal could go no deeper, and you read the engraved line that sat just outside the gap. The number was 0.03 inch, a gap that a breath might fill, and you pulled the gauge out slowly, careful not to drag any wood fibers that might give a false reading later. You took the slate from the ground beside your knee, balanced it on your thigh, and wrote the number with a chalk stub, making a neat little 3 with a small line beneath it. The chalk made a soft scratching noise like a mouse in a wall, and the mark was white and plain against the dark slate. You set the slate down and moved the gauge 4 inches along the tire to the next position you had tapped earlier in the morning. The leaf whispered in again, stopped at the same depth, and you recorded another 0.03 on the slate, the chalk scratching once more. This process continued around the left rear wheel. 24 measurements in all, each taken at a point that corresponded to a spoke or a fellow joint. The locations chosen because they were the places where the wood's grain might have shifted by a microscopic amount. You worked without counting aloud. The rhythm was enough to carry you along, a soft cycle of insert, read, withdraw, mark, move, insert, read. The gauge whispered, the chalk scratched, and the barn around you remained silent except for the creak of a rafter settling in a warmth that had not felt since last autumn. The sunbeam that fell through the east window had crept to full hand's width across the floor since you began, and the block of golden light now touched the edge of the left rear hub, illuminating the iron bands that wrapped the hub's nose. Your mind drifted into the numbers, not as arithmetic but as a kind of landscape. This wheel was a good wheel. The measurement stayed within a narrow range, 0.03 here, 0.04 there, an occasional 0.03 again, with one reading of 0.035 that you estimated by the position of the leaf between the engraved lines. None of the gaps exceeded 0.04, and none fell below 0.05, which would have indicated a pinch that might crack the oak in a dry heat on the plains. You wrote each number on the slate, the marks forming a column that you would wipe clean at the day's end, and you felt a quiet satisfaction that was not pride, but simply a confirmation of things as they should be. A calf lowed from the stone end of the barn, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into your knees. You paused with the gauge halfway to the iron and listened. The calf was hungry, and somewhere a cow answered with a softer moo that rose and fell like a slow wave. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, and then the barn quieted again, the animals settling back into their morning doze. You inserted the gauge into the next position, read 0.04, and wrote it down while the last echo of the cow's voice faded into the hay. The left rear wheel was complete. You straightened your back, pressing your fists into the sides of your spine where a small ache had begun to bloom, and you inspected the column of chalk marks on the slate. They were all within tolerance, a neat family of numbers that told you the tire had not moved 1/1000th of an inch since you had checked it last fall. You wiped the slate clean with the heel of your hand, leaving a pale smudge on your palm, and you moved the grain sack to the right rear wheel. This wheel was the one that had shown the shorter ring during the tapping, the spot near the front seam where the note had decayed a little too quickly. You knelt and placed the gauge at that exact spot first, sliding the leaf into the gap with a care that slowed your breath. The leaf stopped. The engraved line sat at the surface, and the number was Otto .04, a 4/5000ths wider than the average on the left wheel. You wrote it down without alarm. A gap of 0.04 was still within the safe range that would close under a soaking rain, and you knew that the spring weather ahead would provide plenty of moisture before the wagon ever saw a dry prairie. You made a small star next to the number on the slate, a tiny asterisk that meant watch this, not fix this, and you moved on. The rest of the right rear wheel gave you numbers that clustered around 0.03 and 0.04, with one 0.02 that you checked twice, pulling the gauge out and reinserting it from a slightly different angle to be sure. The second reading was 0.03. The first had been fooled by a grain of dust, and you blew on the gap gently before the leaf went in again. The dust flew away, a tiny speck that glittered for a moment in the sunbeam, and the gauge settled at its true number. You wiped the tip of the leaf on your trouser leg and continued. The barn's east window had by now become a square of pure white light, the sun having climbed above the angle where its rays took on any color, and the interior of the barn was fully illuminated. You could see every detail of the right rear wheel, the grain of the oak that ran in pale, parallel waves, the blue-black forge scale that still clung to the inner edge of the tire, the faint scratch marks where the gauge had been inserted before. The wheel seemed to breathe under your hands, not literally, but in the way that wood and metal expand and contract by fractions that only a tool like the gauge could reveal, and attending to those fractions felt like listening to a very slow conversation between two materials that had been forced into a lifelong partnership. A rooster crowed from the farmyard, its call ripping through the morning air with a brassiness that cut across the softer sounds of breeze and birdsong. You did not startle. The rooster had been crowing since before dawn and would crow again at noon, its voice as regular as a town clock. You simply noted the sound and continued sliding the gauge into the next position. The leaf whispering, the chalk scratching, the numbers accumulating on the slate in a column that now extended halfway down the stone. When the right rear wheel was fully measured, you stood and walked to the barn door, the slate tucked under your arm, the gauge still in your hand. The world outside had transformed while you knelt in the dim interior. The mist was entirely gone now, and the pasture grass had become a vivid green under the full April sun. The sorrel mare and the bay gelding had moved to the far end of the field, near the creek, where they cropped grass with slow, mechanical bites. A wagon was visible on the Strasbourg road, a tiny dark line against the bright landscape, and the faint jingle of its trace chains reached you a moment after you saw it. You watched it pass behind a stand of bare walnut trees and reappear on the far side, heading east toward the town. And then you turned back inside, your eyes adjusting once more to the barn's long depth. The front wheels awaited. You knelt at the left front wheel, your knees finding the soft spot of chaff without needing the grain sack, and you began the same sequence. The front tire was tighter than the rear ones, a design choice to account for the greater lateral stress of steering, and the numbers reflected that. The first measurement was 0.02, the tightest you had yet seen, and you paused to consider it. A gap of 0.02 was at the edge of worry, close to a pinch that might compress the fellow wood too much in a wet climate. But you knew that the wagon would be rolling through rain and river crossings within the first week of travel, swelling the oak and pressing it outward against the iron. The tightness would ease. You wrote 0.02 on the slate and made no star, no asterisk, just the number, and moved on. The remaining measurements on the left front wheel ranged from 0.02 to 0.0, with the tighter numbers clustering around the riveted overlap where the extra mass of iron might have caused a slightly more aggressive contraction during the cooling. The gauge whispered in and out, the chalk scratched line after line, and the slate filled with a second column of marks. You noticed that your hand had developed a miniature tremor, not from fatigue, but from the sustained fine motor control of holding the leaf steady, and you paused to let your hand rest on your thigh until the tremor passed. It was gone in 10 breaths, and you resumed. The right front wheel was the last of the 4, and you approached it with the same patience that had carried you through the others. The sun had now moved far enough that the golden rectangle on the barn floor had shifted completely away from the wagon and lay across the doorway itself, warming the threshold wood with a glow that made the grain of the oak look like a map of rivers. You knelt with your back to that light, the warmth spreading across your shoulders, and you inserted the gauge into the first position. The number was 0.03. Familiar and expected, and you wrote it on the slate that was now crowded with chalk marks, the columns running into each other in a way that only you could read. At the 23rd measurement on this final wheel, you encountered something small and out of the ordinary. The gauge leaf slid in and stopped not at a clean number, but at an angle, the edge of the leaf catching on a microscopic burr of wood that had raised up from the fellow surface. You could not see the burr with your naked eye, but you could feel it through the gauge, a tiny catch that transmitted itself up the steel leaf and into your thumb. You pulled the gauge out, ran your fingertip over the spot, and felt nothing but smoothness. The burr was too small for skin to detect. You took the gauge in your left hand and worked the leaf under the burr from the side, nudging it flat with a pressure so light that the leaf itself barely bent. The second insertion stopped cleanly at 0.03, and you wrote the number down with a final scratch of the chalk. The 24th measurement matched, and you set the gauge down on the wagon bed next to the hammer. The slate you held in both hands, looking at the 4 columns of numbers that represented the tension fit of every inch of iron tire on the Conestoga wagon. The range was narrow, 0.02 to 0.02 to 0.02, for fast, with the vast majority clustering at 0.03 and 0.04. Nothing was loose enough to spin in dry heat, nothing was tight enough to crack the wood. The wheels were exactly as they should be, each gap a whisper of breathing room for the oak, each fit a firm handshake between iron and grain. You wiped the slate clean with a damp rag from the workbench, the chalk dissolving into a thin grey paste that you smeared away in one slow stroke. The slate became a dark mirror again, ready for another day's record, and you set it on the bench to dry. The gauge you folded back into its felt bed in the tool chest, the lid closing with the same quiet wooden thump, and you wiped your hands on the front of your trousers, where the chalk dust had left pale handprints. Outside, the rooster crowed again, and the calves in the stone end of the barn lowed their low, rumbling note, the sound rumbling through the floor and into the soles of your boots, where you stood at the bench. You stood still for a moment, your hands resting on the edge of the oak, and you felt the barn around you settle into its midday quiet, the morning's measurement work done as carefully as a watchmaker who had examined every tooth of every wheel. The chalk dust had been wiped from the slate, and the gauge had been returned to its felt bed in the tool chest, and now your hands were empty again, ready for the next task that had been waiting since before the rooster crowed. You stood at the workbench and let your gaze travel over the tools that remained, the wooden mallet, the tin of linseed oil, the bundle of rags, and the small leather bucket with its lid held down by a leather strap and a brass buckle. The bucket was the oldest thing on the bench, its sides dark and supple from years of absorbing oil, its stitching still holding tight, despite the way the tallow inside seemed always to be trying to find a way out. You lifted it by its wire bail and felt the familiar heft, a weight that meant the bucket was still half full, enough for a season of greasing if you were sparing. You carried the bucket to the wagon and set it down on the floor beside the left rear wheel, where the grain sack had been replaced with a fresh handful of straw that you'd scooped from a pile near the calf pen. The straw crackled softly under your boots as you knelt, and you loosened the brass buckle of the bucket's strap with a thumb that knew the movement by heart. The lid came off with a small sucking sound, and the smell inside rose up to meet you, pine tar, sharp and medicinal, blended with the richer, earthier odor of rendered beef tallow. It was a smell that had lived in your clothes and your skin for so many seasons that you no longer noticed it unless you opened a fresh bucket, and even then it was simply the scent of work, not unpleasant, just old and dense and full of memory. The grease inside the bucket was a black paste, stiff at the surface where the air had cooled it, but softer deeper down where it had held the warmth of the barn. You took the worn stick that lived inside the bucket, a length of hickory that had been whittled flat at one end like a narrow spatula, and you stirred the paste with slow circular motions, working the stiffness out until the surface became a glossy, mirror-smooth plane that reflected the dim rafters above. The stirring took time, and you gave it time, your wrist rotating in a rhythm that was almost the same as the tapping rhythm, a tempo the body finds and then forgets it is keeping. The left rear hub stood before you, a massive cylinder of white oak shod with 3 iron bands that kept the wood from splitting. The hub was as wide as a man's head and twice as long, the wood darkened to a deep umber by years of oil and road dust, its surface worn smooth except for the faint tool marks left by the lathe that had shaped it. At the outer end of the hub, facing you, was the grease box, a small iron cup set flush into the wood and held in place by 4 flat-headed screws. The box had a little lid of its own, a round cap with a raised lip, and you pried this open with the tip of the grease stick, the lid rising with a soft metallic click. Inside, the old grease that remained from last season had dried to a crusty rim, and you scraped this out with a few careful strokes of the stick, the dried bits falling onto the straw like dark crumbs. You scooped a generous dollop of fresh grease onto the flat end of the stick, the paste holding its shape in a glossy black mound, and you inserted the stick into the open mouth of the grease box. The space inside was deeper than it looked, a reservoir that ran down beside the iron axle, and you pushed the grease inward with a firm, steady pressure, working the stick from side to pack the paste into every crevice. The grease made a soft, wet squelch as it moved, a sound that was halfway between a sigh and a stir, and you pulled the stick back, scooped another dollop, and pushed it in again, repeating the motion until the box was full and a fresh bead of black grease began to ooze out around the edges, a sign that the reservoir had accepted all it could hold. You wiped the excess grease from the iron rim of the box with a scrap of burlap, turning the cloth this way and that until the metal was clean, and then you replaced the little lid, pressing it down until the click confirmed that it was seated. The hub now wore a thin, even collar of fresh grease around the axle entry, and you nodded to yourself without any outward sign, simply noting that the left rear hub was ready for the miles that waited. The next thing you did was to take hold of 2 spokes on that same wheel and pull gently, rotating the wheel through a full turn while your ear leaned close to the hub. The iron axle moved inside its new bed of grease, with a sound that was not a creak or a groan, but a low, liquid whisper. A sound so smooth that it was almost no sound at all, just the faintest suggestion of metal gliding through a film of tallow and tar. You felt the rotation through your fingers, the steady resistance of the hub turning on a cushion that had been freshly renewed, and you detected no catch, no rough spot, no tiny grain of grit that might begin to wear the iron if left to grind for 100 miles. The wheel turned as if it floated, and you let it coast to a stop with a final, satisfied pat against the felloe. With the left rear hub greased and tested, you picked up the bucket and moved around the wagon to the right rear wheel, your boots sounding the same soft scuffs on the same packed earth that had been under you all morning. The right rear hub was a twin to the left one, the same white oak, worn to the same deep umber, the same 3 iron bands, the same little grease box with its round lid waiting to be opened. You knelt on the fresh straw that rustled beneath you, and you lifted the lid of the box with the stick, noting that this hub's old grease had not dried as much. It was still slightly tacky, a sign that the right wheel had seen more recent lubrication or perhaps had simply been stored a degree cooler. You scraped out the old grease anyway, mixing it with a little fresh paste to soften it, the motion of your hand the same easy practice stroke. You fed the grease into this hub with the same steady push, the stick dipping in and out of the bucket, the paste squelching softly as it filled the reservoir. The smell of pine tar intensified briefly, a sharp, clean note that cut across the heavier tallow scent, and then it settled back into the blended odor that was now a permanent part of the barn's morning air. You worked without hurry, without any awareness of the time passing, because the sunbeam that had been on the threshold was now climbing the far wall and would tell you the hour later if you bothered to look. The right rear hub took slightly less grease than the left one had, its reservoir already close to full, and you were careful not to overpack, stopping when the fresh bead appeared at the edges and smoothing it with the flat of the stick until the iron rim was clean. You turned this wheel through its rotation as well, your hands finding the spokes with the same gentle pull, your ear catching the same liquid whisper. The right rear axle, however, produced a sound that was a shade different from the left, not a grind, but a very faint hiss that rose and fell as the wheel turned. You stopped the rotation and leaned closer, your ear almost touching the iron band, and you listened again while turning the wheel by increments. The hiss was simply air moving through the grease, a tiny bubble trapped during the packing, and you turned the wheel 4 more times in a slow, continuous motion until the bubble worked its way out and the hiss vanished, leaving nothing but the smooth, silent glide of oiled metal. You straightened your back, satisfied, and moved on. The bucket was lighter now, its weight reduced by the grease that now filled 2 of the 4 hubs, and you carried it to the left front wheel with the same steady pace. The front hubs were smaller than the rear ones, scaled down to match the smaller wheels, but their construction was identical: white oak banded with iron, a grease box at the outer end, a reservoir that ran beside the axle. You had greased these hubs more often than the rears, because the front wheels bore the sideways thrust of every turn and the constant vibration of every stone, and the grease here needed to be renewed not just once a season, but several times on a long haul. The old grease inside the left front box was still soft, still dark and usable, and you did not scrape it out entirely but simply added fresh paste on top, working the stick in a spiral motion that mixed the new with the old in a continuous ribbon of black. The creak of your new leather boots sounded sharply as you shifted your weight, a brief interruption in the otherwise quiet rhythm of the work, and you paused to glance up at the open eaves of the barn. A pair of barn swallows had been swooping in and out of the high window for most of the morning, their blue-black wings cutting quick arcs against the pale sky, and now a third swallow joined them, its flight a rapid series of darts and glides that seemed to write a secret script on the air. You watched them for a few slow breaths, the grease stick held loosely in your hand, and then you returned to the hub, your attention settling back into the small space between your hands and the wood. The left front hub accepted its grease with a soft squelch that was higher in pitch than the rear hubs, the smaller cavity producing a tighter sound, and you packed it carefully, stopping just short of full to leave room for the heat expansion that would come on the first day of hard rolling. You replaced the lid, turned the wheel, and felt the same smooth glide under your fingers, the same absence of resistance that told you the iron axle was riding on a perfect film of tallow and tar. The wheel turned as easily as a spinning wheel, each spoke passing through your hand with a light, even pressure, and you let it coast to a stop while the swallows chirped overhead, their calls tiny and sharp as needles. The distant jingle of a neighbor's plow chain reached you through the open barn door, a sound so faint that it might have been imagined. But when you paused and listened, you heard it again, a metallic chime, repeated with the sway of a horse's gait, coming from somewhere up the Strasburg road. It was the ploughman heading to his fields now that the ground had thawed, and the sound was a familiar companion to your spring preparations, a reminder that the whole valley was waking up to the season of work. You did not go to the door to look. You simply acknowledged the sound with a slight tilt of your head, then returned your attention to the bucket and the stick and the last hub that awaited. The right front hub was the final one, and you knelt beside it on the straw that had been scattered there at the start of the morning, the stems now flattened and warm from the sun that had been touching them for an hour. The grease box on this hub was slightly different from the others, its lid a little stiffer to open because the iron had developed a patina of surface rust over the winter, a thin orange bloom that came off on your thumb when you touched it. You worked the lid back and forth a few times until it loosened, and then you cleaned the rust away with a corner of the burlap scrap, wiping until the metal showed its original dark grey. The old grease inside was dry enough to flake, and you spent a little extra time scraping it out, the stick making a soft scratching noise as it dislodged the crust, the dry bits falling onto the straw like black snow. You fed fresh grease into this hub with more patience than the others, because the right front wheel was the one that would take the brunt of the road crown when the wagon travelled. The constant slope of the trail pushing the weight onto this corner, and you wanted the reservoir to be as full and as even as possible. You worked the stick in small circles, tamping the paste down with the flat end, and you added an extra half dollop after the overflow bead appeared, just to be certain. The squelch of the grease was the same sound you had heard 3 times now, but each time it was slightly different in tone or duration. A small variation that came from the size of the hub, the temperature of the metal, the exact consistency of the paste at that moment, and you registered these differences without naming them. When the right front hub was full and its lid was pressed back into place, you turned the wheel through its rotation, your hands moving from spoke to spoke with the same gentle pull. The axle glided silently. Not a whisper or a hiss, just a pure, frictionless turn that ended only when you stopped pulling and let the wheel rest. You stood, lifted the bucket by its bail, and looked at the 4 wheels one by one, each hub now glistening with a faint ring of fresh grease around the axle entry, each wheel ready to roll through whatever weather lay ahead. You carried the bucket back to the workbench, strapped the lid down with the brass buckle, and set it in its customary spot at the end of the oak surface. The bucket would be used again, perhaps in a few weeks on the road, perhaps not until the next spring if the journey went smoothly, but for now it was done, its work complete alongside the hammer and the gauge. You wiped the grease stick clean with a rag, rubbing the flat end until the wood showed its pale grain again, and you dropped the stick back into the bucket where it belonged, the hickory clattering softly against the metal sides. Your hands were black with grease up to the wrists, the paste worked into the creases of your knuckles and under your fingernails, and you walked to the barn door to clean them with a handful of straw from a loose bale. The straw was dry and rough, and you scrubbed your palms together until the grease came away in dark smears, the skin beneath emerging pink and warm. You tossed the soiled straw into a corner where the hens would find it later, and you dried your hands on the front of your trousers, leaving faint new marks on the wool. The swallows had vanished from the eaves while you worked, replaced by a single wren that sat on the top rail of the split fence and sang a brief bubbling song that seemed to ask nothing and expect nothing. The neighbor's plow chain had faded into the distance, and the only sound now was the wind stirring the bare branches of the walnut trees and the occasional low of a calf from the stone end of the barn. You stood in the doorway with your hands in your pockets, the grease bucket behind you, the wagon behind that, and you let the quiet settle over you like a layer of dust that would not be brushed off until the next task called you back inside. The hammer had been on the wagon bed for a while now, its handle cooling after the warmth of your palm, and you picked it up one last time only to carry it to the workbench and set it beside the grease bucket and the slate. Your hands were clean enough, the straw having pulled the worst of the tallow from your skin, and you brushed a few wood shavings from the front of your trousers with a slow sweep of your palm, the shavings spiraling down to join the chife on the packed earth. You looked around the barn and saw that the morning had done its work, and that you had done yours with it. The wheels were sound, the rims were true, the hubs were full of fresh grease, and the sun had shifted from the east window to the higher panes above the loft, which meant the day was sliding toward noon. You thought about the next tasks, the spare rims, the linseed oil, the final walk around, but those were for later, and right now your body was asking for stillness with the same quiet insistence that a dry wheel asks for grease. You walked to the front of the wagon and lowered yourself onto the tongue, the long hickory pole that jutted forward from the front axle like the neck of a resting animal. The tongue was stout enough to bear your weight without flexing, its surface worn smooth by years of hands and yoke straps, and you sat with your legs stretched out before you, your back against the front wheel hub, your shoulders finally releasing a tension you had not known they were holding. The angle of the tongue put you in a direct line with the east window, and the sun fell across you in a broad, warm band, the light so thick and golden that it seemed to have a texture, as if you could reach out and gather it in folds like a bolt of linen. You reached beside you to the wagon bed and lifted the cost bundle that had been waiting there since before dawn. It was a simple square of flour, sack linen, tied at the corners with a bit of twine, and you untied it with the same unhurried fingers that had worked the gauge and the hammer. Inside was a colder biscuit, pale brown and shaped by hand, its surface slightly shiny from the butter that had been worked into the dough the previous evening. Alongside it lay a strip of dried venison, dark as old leather, with a sheen of salt crystals that caught the sun and glittered like tiny mica flecks. There was also a small wrinkled apple left over from the winter cellar, its skin a soft yellow with brown speckles, and you set this on your knee for later. The biscuit was crumbly in the best way, the kind of biscuit that shed a small shower of flakes when you bit into it, and you cupped your free hand under your chin to catch the crumbs before they reached your shirt. The taste was mild and slightly sweet from the wheat, the butter lending a richness that coated your tongue and reminded you that you had not eaten since rising in the dark. You chewed slowly, letting the biscuit soften, your jaw working in a rhythm that matched the slow blinking of your eyes. Outside, the wren was still singing from the fence rail, its bubbling notes falling over each other in a cascade that never quite repeated, and you listened without trying to follow the melody, simply letting the sound wash over you the way the sun was washing over your face. The dried venison came next, a strip as long as your hand and tough enough that you had to tear it with your teeth, pulling it apart with a motion that made your head tilt slightly to the side. The salt struck first, sharp and immediate, and then the deeper flavor of smoked meat unfolded slowly, carrying hints of juniper and maple from the curing rack. It was the venison your brother had prepared back in February, hanging the strips in the smokehouse for a full week while the snow drifted against the door, and you chewed it now with a gratitude that was too familiar to need words. The salt made you thirsty, but the well bucket was across the yard, and you were not ready to rise again. Not yet. While you ate, a movement near the hay bales caught the corner of your eye, a soft grey shape that uncurled itself from the shadows and padded across the packed earth toward you. It was the barn cat, the same grey one that had watched you tapping the rims earlier in the morning, her coat the colour of wood smoke and her eyes a pale green that seemed to hold the light in a calm, flat stare. She did not meow or demand attention. She simply walked up to your boot and rubbed the side of her jaw against the leather. Once, twice, a slow pressure that left a faint smear of her scent on the dark hide. You broke off a corner of the biscuit, a piece no larger than your thumbnail, and set it on the wagon tongue beside your thigh. The cat considered the crumb for a long moment, her whiskers twitching forward, and then she ate it with a delicate crunch, her small jaws working sideways in a way that made her ears wiggle. She looked up at you afterward, her eyes narrowing into contented slits, and she purred. The sound was a low, mechanical hum that vibrated against your leg as she stepped closer, her whole body a small engine of contentment. You scratched behind her ears with one finger, feeling the fine, soft fur and the warm skin beneath, and she leaned into the pressure, her purr deepening until it seemed to resonate through the wagon tongue itself. You ate the rest of the biscuit and venison in silence, sharing an occasional crumb with the cat, and when the food was gone, you wiped your hands on the cloth bundle and folded it into a neat square that you tucked back into the wagon bed. The apple came last, its skin giving under your thumb with a slight give that meant it was soft, but not mealy. You bit into it, and a thin spray of juice caught the sun, the sweetness a bright contrast to the salt of the venison. The apple had been stored in the root cellar all winter, and its flavor had concentrated into something dense and honeyed, the flesh yielding to your teeth with a soft crunch. You ate it down to the core, turning it in your fingers to find every last bit of pale fruit, and then you tossed the core through the open barn door into the pasture, where the sorrel mare would find it later and lip it up with a satisfied snort. The cat watched the apple core arc through the air, her head turning to follow its flight, but she did not leave the wagon tongue. Now the stillness settled over you with its full weight. You sat on the wagon tongue with your hands resting palms up on your thighs, your fingers curled loosely, your breathing slow and even. The sunbeam had warmed the wood beneath you until it was almost as warm as a living thing, and the light moved across your closed eyelids in shifting patterns of orange and gold whenever the breeze stirred the branches outside. You could hear the cat purring, the wren singing, the distant murmur of the creek over its stones, and these sounds blended together into a single, continuous noise that was less like sound and more like silence made audible. A hush that filled the barn and held it suspended. Your thoughts began to drift, unhurried and loose, like milkweed seeds floating over a summer field. You thought about the route to Pittsburgh, the long spine of the Lancaster Turnpike rolling westward through farmland and forest, the places where the road narrowed and the wheels would have to run on the grassy verge, the toll gates with their painted boards and their keepers, who would wave you through because they knew your face. You thought about the river crossings, the Susquehanna at Harrisburg, where the ferry was pulled by a rope and a team of oxen on the far bank, the smaller creeks in the Alleghenies where the wagon would have to ford with water creaking against the hubs. You pictured the iron rims rolling into the cold water, the steam rising where the hot metal met the stream, and you imagined the oak felloes swelling just enough to close the tiny gaps you had measured with the gauge. The thought did not carry worry. It was simply a fact of the road, something that would happen, and that you would handle when it did. Then your mind wandered farther west, to the dry prairie air that would suck the moisture from the wood and make the iron tires contract by a hair's breadth. The same physics that had left the tiny checks in the fellows over winter, repeating itself under a hotter sun and a wider sky. You saw the wheels rolling through grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction, the iron rims leaving parallel tracks in the grey-green sea, and you knew that you would tap and measure and grease again somewhere on that prairie, perhaps under a lone cottonwood tree with the wind humming through its leaves. The thought settled in your chest with the same calm as the biscuit had settled in your stomach, a quiet acceptance of future work that asked nothing of you right now, in this moment, on this wagon tongue. The motes of dust were dancing in the sunbeam, thousands of them, each one a tiny speck of hay chaff and dried manure and pulverized earth that had been kicked up by hooves and boots and wheels over the years. You watched them float and swirl, their movements so slow and random that it seemed they were not falling at all, but simply drifting in place, suspended in the golden light. A single mote, larger and paler than the others, rose on an invisible current of warm air and traced a spiral path upward toward the rafters, and you followed it with your eyes until it disappeared into the shadows where the swallows had been swooping. The effort of watching was so slight that it was not effort at all, just a gentle resting of the gaze on something that moved without purpose. The grey cat had stopped purring. You looked down and saw that she had curled herself into a tight circle on the cloth bundle you had left beside you, her tail wrapped over her nose, her sides rising and falling with the shallow, rapid breaths of feline sleep. She had found the folded blanket you had tossed onto the wagon bed that morning, a scrap of wool dyed with madder root to a faded rust red, and she was using it as a cushion, her grey fur blending into the shadows of the folds. You did not disturb her. The warmth of the sun, the quiet of the barn, the small weight of the sleeping animal beside you, these things had woven themselves into a kind of spell that did not need breaking. You closed your eyes and let your head rest against the cool iron of the front hub, the contrast between the warm sun on your face and the cold metal on your scalp, a pleasant reminder of where you were. Behind your closed eyelids, the world became a field of soft orange fading to deep brown at the edges. You could still hear the wren, the creek, the occasional rustle of straw as a mouse moved through its tunnels in the hay. You could still smell the pine tar in your hands, the faint biscuit, butter on your breath, the dry vanilla scent of old hay. Your heartbeat was slow, your muscles loose, your mind emptied of its list of tasks, tap, listen, measure, grease, having receded into a distant hum that would return when you were ready, but that for now had no claim on you. Time passed without measure. The sun crept another hand's width across the floor, the rectangle of light elongating until it touched the base of the workbench and began to climb the leg. The cat twitched once in her sleep, her paw paddling at some dream mouse, and then she was still again. Outside, the sorrel mare nickered softly to the bay gelding, and he answered with a low snort, their exchange as brief and meaningless as a nod between neighbors. You sat in the middle of all this, neither asleep nor fully awake, inhabiting the quiet space between tasks that was itself a kind of task, a rest that was as necessary to the journey as the tightest tire rim or the fullest grease box. When you finally opened your eyes, the quality of the light had changed again, the deep gold of mid-morning giving way to the paler, sharper white of a sun that had climbed past the barn roof and was now shining directly down through the high windows. The dust motes were fewer now, the air settling into the stillness of midday. You took a long breath, the kind that reaches all the way to the bottom of the lungs, and you let it go with a sigh that was not tiredness but release. The cat did not stir. You looked at her small grey shape on the red wool blanket, at the way the sun picked out the silver guard hairs along her spine, and you decided that you would not move her. The blanket could stay where it was until she woke on her own. You stood from the wagon tongue, your legs a little stiff, but your back loose and easy, and you stretched your arms overhead, your fingers brushing the cool air above the wagon bed. The list of tasks was starting to reassemble itself in the back of your mind. The spare rims waiting under the wagon, the linseed oil on the bench, the final walk around by lantern light. But these thoughts came softly now, padded by the rest you had taken, and they carried no urgency. The morning had been full of tapping and measuring and greasing, and the afternoon would be full of other things. But right now there was only this moment of standing, the cat asleep on the blanket, the wren still singing on the fence rail, the whole world holding its breath in the warm, still heart of the day. The crack had been sitting in the back of your mind since the tapping, a small dark line on the right rear rim near the forward seam that you had noticed during the daylight inspection, and then confirmed with the hammer's slightly shorter ring. It was not a crack that threatened to split the tire open, not yet, but it was a crack that would widen on a rocky ford or a mountain descent if left untreated, the kind of flaw that began as a hair's-breadth fissure and grew with every mile until the iron broke clean through on a stretch of road far from any smithy. You knew this the way you knew the sound of a true wheel, not with alarm but with a quiet certainty that left no room for delay. The rest had been good, the biscuit and the venison, and the cat asleep on the blanket, but now your body was ready to work again, and the repair was the next thing calling. You walked to the workbench and gathered what you needed with the same unhurried movements that had carried you through the morning. A short rod of iron, no longer than your forearm, that you had stored under the bench wrapped in oiled paper. A small cross-peen hammer with a face the size of a thumbnail for the delicate work. The wooden mallet, fat and solid, its dogwood head scarred from years of striking chisels. A file with a clean, sharp tooth. A cloth bundle of copper rivets, each one 1/4 inch thick and long enough to pass through 2 layers of iron with room to peen over on the far side. A pair of tongs for handling hot metal. You carried these things outside in 2 trips, setting them on the flat stone that served as a work surface beside the forge pit. The forge pit was a small, simple thing built into the ground just outside the barn's east wall, away from the hay and the straw, but close enough to be sheltered by the overhanging eaves. It was a rectangular hollow lined with firebrick, its sides blackened by the smoke of many small fires, and beside it stood a hand-cranked blower with a leather bellows that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. You had not fired the forge since the previous November, when you shaped a new hasp for the barn door, and the firebricks were cold and damp with the dew that had collected overnight. You knelt and cleared the leaves and twigs that had blown into the pit over the winter, scooping them out with your bare hands and tossing them into the pasture where the sorrel mare sniffed them and turned away. You built the fire small, because this was not a day for heavy forge work, but only for taking the chill off a short rod of iron. A handful of dry straw went into the bottom of the pit first, the same straw you had been kneeling on all morning, and on top of that you arranged a small teepee of kindling dry walnut twigs, pine splinters, a few scraps of old oak fellow that had been too short to use for anything else. You struck a lucifer match against the brick and touched it to the straw, which flared up with a crackle and a puff of pale smoke. The kindling caught slowly at first, the damp air fighting the flame, and then the pine splinters began to pop and hiss, their resin bubbling out in tiny golden beads that sizzled and burned with a sharp, clean smell. You crouched on your heels and let the fire establish itself, adding a few lumps of charcoal from the bucket beside the pit, the black lumps hissing as the heat drove out the last of their moisture. While the fire grew, you unwrapped the iron rod and laid it across the flat stone. It was a piece of low-carbon iron, softer than the tire steel, so that it could be worked cold to a certain degree, but you would warm it anyway to make the hammering easier and to prevent the metal from cracking under the repeated blows. You measured the rod against the hairline crack on the rim, holding it up to the wheel and marking the length with a short scratch of a nail, and then you cut it with a cold chisel and 2 sharp blows of the mallet, the iron parting with a crisp snap. The piece was now no longer than your palm, a small rectangle of dark grey metal with edges that showed the crystalline grain of the original casting. The fire was ready when the charcoal had all caught and the column of heat shimmered in the air above the pit, making the barn wall waver like a reflection in water. You took the cut piece of iron in the tongs, gripping it firmly just past the midpoint, and you laid it across the heart of the fire, where the charcoal glowed a steady orange red, the color of a pumpkin left too long on the vine. You waited, without counting, watching the metal change. First it stayed dark, resisting the heat. Then a faint bloom of color began to spread across the surface, a stain of pale gold that deepened through amber, through bronze, to a soft cherry red that was just enough for the work ahead. You pulled the iron from the fire with the tongs and moved to the flat stone, where you had set up a small anvil no bigger than a brick on its end. The cross-peen hammer was waiting, its handle cool and dry, and you took it up and began to shape the patch strap with a series of light, glancing blows. The iron was soft from the heat, yielding under the hammer face with a compliant give that was different from the hard ring of the cold tire, a muted thump that sounded more like a mallet on leather than metal on metal. You worked the edges first, rounding the corners so they would not catch on stones, and then you shaped the ends into gentle tapers that would lie flat against the tire without creating a lip that might snag. The work took fewer strikes than you might have guessed, the iron obedient under the hammer, the patch slowly becoming the shape you had seen in your mind's eye before you ever picked up the tongs. The heat faded as you worked, the cherry red dimming through bronze to grey, and when the metal was too cool to move further, you set it back in the fire and waited while it climbed through the colors again. The patch strap was finished on its second heat, the final strokes of the hammer adding a slight curve that matched the arc of the tire rim. You held it up to the wheel one more time, checking the fit, and the curve was close enough that only a little persuasion would be needed to bring it flush against the iron. You set the patch on the stone to cool, the grey surface darkening as the heat left it, and you laid the hammer beside it with the handle pointing toward the barn. The fire in the pit was still glowing, the charcoal collapsing into a bed of white-edged embers, and you let it be. The coals would last another hour, and you might need them again if the patch required a final adjustment after riveting. Now came the patient work of preparing the repair site. You carried the patch back to the right rear wheel, where the afternoon light was falling through the high windows in long slanting bars that crossed the wagon bed and the floor. You knelt beside the wheel, the straw still scattered where you had been working earlier, and you laid the patch over the hairline crack with the care of someone placing a bookmark between the pages of a heavy volume. The crack ran from the edge of the tire inward for about an inch, a thin black line that was barely visible unless you tilted your head to catch the light just so. You took the file and began to clean the surface of the tire on either side of the crack, drawing the file across the metal with smooth, even strokes that left bright silver trails in the dark patina. The file made a soft zr, zr, zr that was distinct from any other sound you had made that day, a steady scrape that removed the surface rust and the forge scale and left bare iron that would grip the patch with all its strength. You filed until the area was a neat rectangle of clean metal, slightly larger than the patch strap, the edges sharply defined against the older, darker surface of the tire. Then you took the patch and clamped it over the crack with a small hand clamp that you tightened by turning a wooden handle, the iron jaws biting down on the patch and the tire together. The clamp held the strap in place while you marked the positions for the rivet holes, 4 holes in a shallow arc that followed the curve of the patch, each mark a small dot of white chalk that stood out against the dark metal. You removed the clamp and set the patch aside, and then you took up a hand drill, a tool with a wooden body and a crank that turned a steel bit no thicker than a knitting needle. The drilling was the slowest part of the work, the kind of labor that asked nothing of the mind and everything of the hands. You positioned the bit on the first chalk mark and began to turn the crank, the drill whirring softly, the steel chewing into the iron with a sound that was deeper than the file's scrape, a low grinding noise that rose and fell with the speed of the crank. The hole deepened by fractions, the iron giving way grain by grain, and you added a drop of linseed oil from the tin on the bench to ease the bit's passage, the oil pooling in the growing hole and turning dark with iron dust. When the bit broke through the far side of the tire, the resistance changed, a subtle release that you felt through the crank handle, and you pulled the drill out and blew the metal dust away with a puff of breath that scattered the fine black particles into the straw. You drilled the second hole, and the third, and the fourth, each one a patient repetition of the first. The drill bit grew warm under the friction, and you paused occasionally to let it cool, wiping it with the burlap rag and dipping it in the oil tin. The 4 holes, when they were finished, were a neat constellation on the tire, each one a clean cylinder through the iron, their edges sharp and bright. You held the patch up to the holes and saw that the chalk marks on the strap aligned with the holes beneath, a small satisfaction that came and went without comment. The copper rivets came out of their cloth bundle, 4 of them, each one a short, thick cylinder with a round head on one end and a plain shank on the other. The copper was a soft rosy gold, the color of a new penny before the minting, and it was softer than the iron, so that it would peen over easily without cracking the tire. You inserted the first rivet through the patch and into the first hole, pushing it in with your thumb until the round head sat flush against the strap. The fit was snug, the rivet shank filling the hole with only the slightest friction, and you tapped it home with the small cross-peen hammer, a gentle tick that set the head against the patch. The riveting was a small, quiet music that filled the barn with the same steady rhythm as the tapping had that morning. You set a heavy iron bucking bar against the head of the rivet on the front side, bracing it with your left hand, and you worked the shank with the cross-peen hammer from the back side, striking the center of the copper with light, glancing blows that spread the soft metal outward into a mushroom cap. The hammer made a muffled tick, tick, tick that mingled with the caw of crows in the bare walnut trees outside, the birds calling back and forth in their harsh, flat voices. You worked each rivet in turn, the copper yielding under the hammer until all 4 shanks had been peened into smooth, round caps that matched the heads on the front side. The patch strap now held against the tire as firmly as a stitch in a coat. You ran your thumb over the rivet caps, feeling the smooth domes and the slight warmth that the hammering had left in the copper, and then you ran your thumb over the edges of the patch strap, feeling that the tapers lay flat and would not catch a stone or a branch. The repair was solid, a quiet, permanent thing that would outlast the journey and all the journeys after, and you knew without testing that the crack beneath the patch was closed and stilled, held fast by the copper rivets and the tight fit of the strap. The fire in the forge pit had burned down to a bed of grey ash, with a few orange embers still pulsing at the center, and you fetched a bucket of water from the rain barrel and poured it slowly over the coals until the hiss stopped and the smoke rose in a final thin column that drifted over the barn roof. The embers turned black and cold, and you stirred them with the tongs to make sure no spark remained. Then you gathered the tools, the cross-peen hammer, the wooden mallet, the file, the tongs, and the drill. You carried them all back inside, wiping each one with the burlap rag before setting it on the bench, the tools still warm from your hands and the work they had done. The forge was cold now, the stone beside it swept clean of metal shavings, and you stood in the barn doorway looking at the right rear wheel where the patch strap sat against the tire. The fresh iron of the patch was a lighter grey than the older tire, a small rectangle of new metal among the dark patina, and the copper rivets glowed a soft rose, gold in the afternoon light that slanted through the high windows. The repair would age quickly on the road, the patch darkening with rust and dust until it blended with the original tire, and by the time the wagon reached the Ohio River, no eye would be able to tell where the crack had been. You walked to the wheel, knelt one last time, and tapped the repaired section with the ball-peen hammer that had started the morning. The ring that came back was a single, true note, clear and long, indistinguishable from the ring of any other spot on any other wheel. The patch was part of the wagon now, and the wagon was whole. The patch strap was done, and the forge was cold, its ashes stirred and drowned and safe, and you had carried the tools back to the workbench one by one until the flat oak surface held only the things you still needed and nothing more. The afternoon had settled into the barn with a heavier quality than the morning, the air thicker and warmer, the dust hanging motionless in the long bars of sunlight that slanted through the high windows. You could feel the day turning slowly on its axis, the morning's crisp edge softening into a drowsy, golden stillness that made every movement feel deliberate and unhurried. The list in the back of your mind had shortened by now. Tap and listen and measure and grease all crossed off, the repair crossed off, and what remained was the oiling and the spare rims and the final walk-around by lantern light. Tasks that asked for patience rather than strength. You walked to the workbench and took up the tin of linseed oil, a rectangular can with a tight-fitting lid that you pried open with the tip of a worn screwdriver that lived on the bench for exactly this purpose. The lid came up with a soft pop, and the smell that rose from the tin was warm and nutty and faintly sweet, the odor of crushed flax seeds, a smell that belonged to wood shops and painter studios and barns where tools were cared for. The oil was a pale amber, clear and thick, and it caught the light as you tilted the tin, the surface shimmering with a golden iridescence that reminded you of the way the creek looked just before sunset. You set the tin on the floor beside the left rear wheel and pulled a clean rag from the bundle on the bench, a square of soft flour, sack linen that had been washed so many times it had no lint left to shed. The rag went into the oil with a gentle dip, the corner darkening as the amber liquid climbed the fibers, and you folded the cloth into a neat pad that fit in your palm. You began at the top of the left rear tire, where the iron was warmest from the afternoon sun that had been touching it through the high window, and you wiped the oil onto the metal with a long, smooth stroke. The oil spread behind the rag in a thin, glossy film, darkening the charcoal patina to a deep, wet brown that looked almost black in the shadows, the color of strong coffee held up to a candle. The metal drank the oil slowly, the microscopic pores that had held rust at bay for a winter now filling with fresh protection, and you worked the rag from top to bottom in overlapping bands, each stroke overlapping the last by half its width, so that no spot was missed. The motion was monotonous in the most peaceful sense, a back-and-forth glide that traveled from your shoulder to your wrist with the same steady rhythm as the tapping had that morning, though softer now, almost silent. The rag made a faint shushing sound against the iron, like a mother quieting a child, and you let your breathing match the stroke. In on the down, out on the up, your body settling into the work the way a boat settles into still water. The oil smell grew stronger as you worked, the nutty sweetness filling the air around you and mixing with the older scents of hay and tallow, and the faint mineral tang of the forge smoke that still clung to your clothes. You worked your way around the left rear wheel in slow degrees, rotating the wheel by the spokes when you needed to reach a new section, the hub turning easily on its fresh bed of grease. The oil darkened the iron to a uniform deep charcoal brown, erasing the slight color differences you had noticed during the morning inspection, the forge scale and the burnished patches and the rust freckles all blending into a single even tone that looked solid and permanent. The linseed oil would dry over the next few days into a thin, hard skin that water could not penetrate, the same skin that painters used to protect their colors, the same skin that cabinet makers rubbed into walnut and cherry, and you trusted it to hold through the wet mountain passes ahead. Your hand grew black as you worked, the oil mixing with the fine iron dust that still clung to the tire from the drilling and the filing, and you paused occasionally to wipe your palm on a ball of straw that you kept beside your knee. The straw turned dark and greasy, and you tossed it into the corner with the other spent straw when it became too saturated to use, pulling a fresh handful from the pile. The pile was smaller now than it had been that morning, reduced by your kneeling and your cleaning and your forge fire, and you made a mental note to pull more from the stack outside the calf pen before the day was over. When the left rear tire was done and gleaming in the slanted light, you straightened your back and walked around to the right rear wheel, the oil tin in one hand and the rag in the other. The right rear tire still smelled faintly of the forge work, the patch strap warm under your fingers when you touched it, the copper rivets slightly brighter than before because the oil had not yet reached them. You began the same process, dipping the rag into the tin, folding it into a pad, wiping the oil onto the iron in long, slow strokes that followed the curve of the wheel from ground to hub. The oil crept over the patch strap and the rivets without distinction, treating the old metal and the new metal with the same amber generosity. And when you had finished, the repair blended into the tire so completely that a stranger would not have known it was there. A noise interrupted the quiet rhythm of your work, a sudden clatter that came from somewhere high in the barn, and you paused with the rag halfway up the wheel and looked toward the sound. It was the loft window, the small square opening in the haymow that faced the pasture, and the leather hinge that held its shutter had loosened over the winter so that the breeze caught the shutter and knocked it against the frame. The noise was not loud, not startling, just a wooden rap that came and went with the gusts, and you set the rag down on the rim of the oil tin and walked to the base of the ladder that led to the loft. The ladder was a simple thing, 2 long poles of spruce with rungs lashed between them, and it creaked under your weight as you climbed, a soft groaning that blended with the rustle of the hay in the loft. The loft smelled different from the barn floor below, drier and warmer, the hay packed tight into bales that released a dusty sweetness when you brushed against them. The shutter was still clattering, a loose, rhythmic banging that was louder up here, and you crossed the loft in 4 steps and caught the shutter with one hand, holding it still. The view through the open window was a square of bright green pasture and pale blue sky. The sorrel mare and the bay gelding now grazing near the split rail fence with their tails switching lazily at the first flies of the season, and you paused for a moment, looking out. The breeze cool on your face after the warmth of the low barn. You found a scrap of wood on the loft floor, a broken piece of lath that had been left there after the last roof repair, and you wedged it between the shutter frame and the window casing, tapping it in with the heel of your hand until the shutter was held firm. The clattering stopped, and the loft fell back into its deep, dusty quiet. You climbed down the ladder, the rungs creaking in reverse order, and you picked up the rag and the oil tin from where you had left them beside the right rear wheel, returning to the work as if you had never paused. The front wheels came next, and you knelt beside the left front tire with the rag freshly dipped and the oil still glistening on your fingers. This wheel was smaller and easier to reach, and you wiped the oil on in continuous strokes that traveled from the bottom of the arc up and over the top in one smooth motion, your arm sweeping like a painter, laying down a wash. The nutty smell of the linseed had become the dominant odor in the barn now, overriding everything except the occasional drift of hay sweetness from the loft above, and you associated that smell with readiness, with the final preparation that came just before a long journey. The scent of tools put away and surfaces protected and everything in its place. The right front wheel was the last of the 4, and you worked your way around it with the same patient strokes, noticing how the oil darkened the iron to the exact same shade as the other 3 wheels, a uniform, sober brown-black that looked dignified and capable. When the entire tire had been coated and no dry spot remained, you sat back on your heels and examined the 4 wheels in turn, the light catching the wet sheen of the oil and throwing back a dull, liquid gleam that softened the hard edges of the metal. The wagon looked different now than it had that morning, not in any dramatic way, but in the small, cumulative way that cared for things always look. The way a swept floor looks cleaner, even before the dirt is gone, the way a brushed horse looks sleeker, even before the saddle goes on. You rose and walked to the open barn door, the rag still in your hand, the oil tin still on the floor beside the wagon, and you stood in the doorway looking out at the afternoon. The sun had moved farther west than you had realized, the hours of the repair and the oiling having slipped past without notice, and the light outside had taken on the deeper, richer color that came in the hour before evening. The shadows of the walnut trees stretched long across the pasture grass, their bare branches tracing a dark lacework on the green, and the creek at the bottom of the field caught the sunlight in a series of bright flashes that moved with the current. The air was still warm, but the breeze had picked up slightly, carrying the smell of wet earth from the ploughed fields up on the ridge, and the fainter, sweeter smell of the first wild flowers blooming along the fence rows. You wiped your hands on the rag, then on a fresh ball of straw that you pulled from the pile just inside the door, the straw scrubbing against your palms with a crisp, dry rasp that lifted most of the oil from your skin. The oil that remained would soak in overnight and leave your hands soft and dark-stained. the hands of someone who worked with iron and wood and who carried the marks of the work as a matter of course. You folded the rag into a neat square and set it on the bench to dry, where it would stiffen by morning and need to be worked loose before the next use, and you pressed the lid back onto the linseed oil tin, tapping it down with the heel of your palm until it seated with a soft thump. The tin went back onto the shelf above the workbench, beside the grease bucket and the tool chest, and you stood for a moment with your hands on your hips, looking around the barn. The Conestoga wagon sat in its accustomed place, the blue painted bed glowing faintly in the dim light, the four wheels dark and glossy with their fresh coat of oil, the repair patch a neat rectangle of new iron on the right rear rim. Everything was as it should be, and the quiet in the barn was the quiet of a task completed, not the empty silence of a place abandoned, but the full silence of a place that has been worked in and cared for and left in good order. You walked back to the doorway and leaned against the frame, one shoulder against the worn wood, your arms crossed loosely over your chest. The crows that had been calling during the repair had moved on, replaced by a pair of mourning doves that sat on the peak of the barn roof and cooed their soft, three-note call, "Oh, woe, woe, hoo," over and over, a sound so familiar and so drowsy that it seemed to be the voice of the afternoon itself. The neighbor's plough chain no longer jingled on the road, the ploughman having finished his morning's work and taken his horse home, and the Strasbourg road was empty in both directions, a pale ribbon of dirt that wound between the fields and disappeared over the rise. You stayed there in the doorway for a span of minutes that you did not count, the doves cooing overhead, the breeze stirring the hair at your temples, your body heavy with the good tiredness that came from a full day of steady work. The sun moved another fraction of its arc toward the horizon, the shadows lengthening incrementally, the gold of the light deepening toward amber. You thought of nothing urgent, nothing that needed deciding or solving, only the quiet awareness that the spare rims still waited under the wagon bed, and that the lantern would be lit again at dusk, and that there would be time enough for everything that remained. You blinked at the brightness of the afternoon, the white gold glare that filled the whole sky above the barn, and then you pushed yourself off the doorframe and turned back inside, ready for the next thing, and the quiet that came with it. The afternoon had not yet begun its slow slide into evening, and the sun still held its place above the orchard trees, but the light inside the barn had shifted into a deeper amber tone that pooled in the corners and made the shadows softer. You had put away the linseed oil and the rag, and your hands were dry now. The skin darkened faintly from the oil and the iron dust that had worked into the creases of your knuckles over the long day. The wagon stood in the center of the barn with its four wheels glossy and dark, the repair patch on the right rear rim a small quiet testament to the morning's attention, and you were not quite finished yet. Beneath the wagon bed, riding in a long wooden cradle that hung between the front and rear axles, lay the spare rims wrapped in burlap, and they had been waiting for your attention since before the first robin sang. You walked to the side of the wagon and lowered yourself onto one knee, then both, until you were lying on your back on the packed earth with your head and shoulders beneath the wagon bed. The space under a Conestoga wagon is a low, dim cave framed by the four wheels and the heavy axles, and the smell here was different from the rest of the barn, earthier and more confined, with a trace of old iron and the musty sweetness of burlap that had been wetted and dried many times. The light filtered through the spokes of the wheels in thin, dusty blades, enough to see by once your eyes adjusted, and you lay there for a moment simply looking up at the cradle and the wrapped rims and the underside of the bedboards where the blue paint had never reached. The cradle was a simple construction of two oak rails, notched at the ends to fit into iron brackets bolted to the axle beams, and it held two full hoops of spare iron tire wrapped tightly in burlap and lashed in place with leather straps. The spare rims had been forged at the same time as the tires on the wheels back in Jacob Brubaker's smithy the previous autumn, and they were identical in every dimension, a half-inch thick and 3 inches wide, curved into perfect circles and left to cool slowly in a bed of wood ash, so that the iron would be tough rather than brittle. They had ridden under the wagon since the day they were made, waiting for a journey long enough to need them. You reached up and began to work the buckles on the leather straps, the brass tongues sliding out of their holes with a soft, familiar friction. the leather stiff from the dry winter and faintly whitened with bloom that came off on your fingers like a fine dust. The straps loosened one by one, 4 of them, each one a wide band of cowhide that had been oiled and stretched and stitched with waxed linen thread. And as they came free, you coiled them loosely and set them aside on the ground beside your hip. The burlap wrapping was next, a long strip of coarse brown cloth that had been wound around the 2 rims in overlapping layers like a bandage, and you found the tucked end and began to unwind it with the same patient, methodical motion you had used on the linseed oil rag. The burlap came away in slow spirals, releasing a fine dust that drifted down onto your face and made you blink, and you paused to wipe your eyes with the back of your wrist before continuing. The spare rims emerged from their wrapping gradually, the dark grey iron appearing in widening bands between the remaining folds, and when the burlap at last fell away and joined the coiled straps on the ground, you had before you 2 perfect hoops of iron, their surfaces dark and faintly mottled with the bloom of a winter spent in the cold space beneath the wagon. They looked like sleeping snakes, coiled and still, waiting for the warmth of your hands. You slid out from under the wagon, pulling the first spare rim with you, the iron heavy and awkward but not unmanageable, its weight settling against your chest as you lifted it clear and carried it into the open floor of the barn, where the light was better. You leaned the rim against the workbench, the iron ringing faintly as it touched the oak, and you took up the burlap rag you had used for cleaning and began to wipe the surface of the metal with the same care you had given the tires on the wheels. The bloom came away easily, a fine grey-brown powder that left the iron dark and clean beneath, and you checked the rim for rust freckles, the way you had checked the wheels at dawn, running your fingers over every inch of the surface, pausing at the riveted overlaps where the seams might have loosened during the cold months. The first spare rim was sound, its surface smooth and unbroken, its rivets tight, its curve true when you sighted along it against the straight edge of the workbench. You set it aside against the wall and went back under the wagon for the second one, the same process repeated, the same weight against your chest, the same careful wiping and inspection in the amber light. The second rim was also sound, though it carried a small, shallow scratch near one of the rivet holes where the smith's punch had slipped during the forging, a flaw so minor that it would disappear after the first mile of rolling, and you noted it without concern, the way you might note a freckle on a familiar face. With both rims cleaned and inspected, you turned your attention to the tallow. The leather bucket was still on the workbench, its lid still buckled, the black paste inside still soft from the warmth of the afternoon, and you opened it and took up the worn hickory stick that served as your applicator. The spare rims needed a heavier coat of tallow than the wheels had received, because they would ride under the wagon through rain and mud and river crossings, exposed to every kind of moisture that the road could throw at them, and the tallow would form a thick waxy barrier that water could not penetrate. You scooped a generous amount of the black paste onto the stick and began to work it into the surface of the first rim, spreading it in wide, even strokes that filled the microscopic pores of the iron and left behind a soft, dull sheen. The tallow had a different smell from the linseed oil, more animal and less sweet. The heavy odor of rendered fat and pine tar that clung to your hands and your clothes, and the air around you. You worked the paste into the riveted overlaps with extra care, forcing it into the hairline gaps where the iron ends met, and you paid the same attention to the inner edge of the rim that would face the road grit when the spare was mounted. The second rim received the same treatment, the stick dipping into the bucket and spreading the black paste in long, smooth arcs, until both hoops gleamed with a protective coat that was thicker and waxier than the linseed sheen on the wheels above. The burlap wrapping needed attention next. You lifted the long strip of cloth from the ground and shook it out, the dust rising in a pale cloud that drifted toward the open door and dissipated in the breeze. The burlap was still strong, the weave tight and unbroken, but one edge had frayed during the winter from rubbing against the cradle rail, and you spent a few minutes trimming the loose threads with a small knife you carried in your vest pocket, the blade sharp enough to cut the coarse fibers with a single stroke. You folded the burlap into a wide, flat rectangle, smoothing the creases with your palm until the cloth lay flat and even, and you set it aside on the bench while you tended to the leather straps. The straps were as important as the rims themselves, the only thing holding the spare iron in place over rough roads and sudden jolts, and you examined each one carefully, bending the leather back and forth to check for cracks, running your thumb along the stitching to feel for popped threads. The leather had dried over the winter and needed oiling, so you took the rag that still held a residue of linseed oil and worked it into the straps one by one, the thirsty hide drinking the oil eagerly, darkening from pale tan to a deep, rich brown. The buckles were solid brass, green with a thin patina of verdigris that you rubbed away with a corner of the rag until the metal showed its warm golden color. When all 4 straps were oiled and supple, you coiled them loosely and set them beside the folded burlap. Now came the quiet, careful work of repacking the spare rims into their cradle. You carried the first rim back under the wagon, sliding it into the forward notch of the cradle, where it would ride nearest the front axle, the iron heavy and cool against your palms. The rim settled into place with a soft clunk, the tallow on its surface leaving a faint smear on the oak rail, and you held it there with one hand while you reached for the burlap with the other. Wrapping the rims was a two-handed job, and you worked slowly, feeding the burlap around the iron in tight, overlapping turns the way you might bandage a horse's leg, each pass snug against the last, the coarse cloth gripping the tallow with a slight tackiness that kept it from slipping. The second rim went into the rear notch of the cradle, and you wrapped it in the remaining length of burlap, tucking the end under the final turn with a firm push of your thumb. The 2 hoops now lay side by side in their cloth cocoon, only their edges visible, dark circles of iron peeking through the brown weave. You took the leather straps one by one and passed them over the wrapped rims and through the iron brackets on the cradle rails, pulling each strap tight before buckling it, the brass tongues clicking into their holes with a series of small, satisfying sounds. The rims were secure, as immovable as the axles themselves, and they would ride there through rain and dust and heat, until the day they were needed, a quiet insurance against whatever the road might bring. You slid out from under the wagon and stood, brushing the dust and bits of straw from the back of your shirt and trousers, your hair now carrying a fine sprinkling of burlap fibers that glinted in the amber light. The barn had grown dimmer while you worked under the wagon, the sun having slipped another degree toward the horizon, and the shadows under the eaves had deepened from grey to a soft, dusty purple. The air was cooler now, the afternoon warmth beginning to retreat, and you could smell the first hint of evening in the breeze that came through the door, that particular damp green smell that rises from the grass when the dew is still some hours away. You stood for a moment with your hands resting on the wagon bed, looking at the 4 wheels and the patch and the empty workbench and the space beneath the wagon where the spare rims now rode, wrapped and oiled and ready. The day had been long, longer than most days before a journey, and your body carried the record of it in the ache behind your shoulders and the stiffness in your knees and the fine, persistent tiredness that had begun to settle into your bones. It was not an unpleasant tiredness, but a deep, clean fatigue that came from steady, useful work, and you knew that you would sleep well tonight in the quiet farmhouse, the quilt pulled up to your chin, the windows dark and still. A movement outside the open door caught your eye, and you turned to see a neighbor boy walking along the split-rail fence with a fishing pole over his shoulder, a long cane rod with a length of line wrapped around the tip, and a small tin bait bucket swinging from his other hand. He was perhaps 9 years old, barefoot despite the April chill, his trousers rolled to his knees, and he walked with the loose, ambling stride of a boy who had nowhere to be, and all afternoon to get there. When he reached the section of fence nearest the barn, he stopped and leaned the fishing pole against the top rail and rested his arms there, looking in at you with the frank, unself-conscious curiosity of a child who had seen you working all day from a distance and had finally decided to come closer. You gave him a small nod, the same nod you might give a neighbor at a husking bee or a drover passing on the turnpike, and he nodded back without speaking. No words passed between you, but the quiet companionship of the gesture was enough. A brief acknowledgement that you were both inhabitants of the same afternoon, both moving through the same patch of Lancaster County spring. He watched you for a span of minutes while you wiped the last of the tallow from the hickory stick and returned it to the bucket, and when you looked up again, he had lifted his pole and was walking on toward the creek, his bare feet leaving faint prints in the new grass. You watched him go until he disappeared behind the black walnut trees, and then you turned back to the workbench, the small interruption having come and gone like a cloud passing the sun. The bucket lid was buckled down again, the spare rims were stowed, the burlap scraps were swept into a pile with the other spent straw, and you found yourself standing in the middle of the barn with nothing immediate left to do. The tools were all on the bench, each in its place: the ball-peen hammer, the wooden mallet, the thin metal gauge in its felt bed, the cross-peen hammer from the repair, the file, the hand drill, the linseed oil tin, the tallow bucket. They were arranged in a loose row, the order of their use still reflected in their positions, and you looked at them the way you might look at a set of well-worn books on a shelf, each one holding the memory of a particular task, a particular hour of a particular day. You walked to the doorway once more and looked out at the angle of the sun, a habit so old that you no longer noticed yourself doing it. The sun was perhaps an hour and a half above the orchard trees, its lower edge just beginning to touch the bare branches of the farthest apple tree, and you knew without a clock that you had time enough for the final walk-around before dusk and the lighting of the lantern. The evening would come slowly, the way spring evenings do, the light lingering in the sky long after the sun was gone, the first fireflies rising from the grass like sparks from a fire that had not yet been lit. You thought of the kitchen in the farmhouse, the smell of bread baking, the sound of water being drawn from the well, and you knew that you would go there soon, but not quite yet. There was still the matter of the final check, the slow walk around the wagon by lantern light, the last look at the iron rims that would carry everything west. Dusk came to the Conestoga Valley not as a single moment, but as a slow, patient seep of color, the blue of the sky deepening through lavender into a soft plum, while the last sunlight drained from the orchard and left the bare apple trees standing in silhouette against the western glow. You had been standing in the barn doorway for a stretch of minutes that felt both brief and long, your shoulders resting against the worn frame, your hands loose at your sides, watching the shadows stretch across the pasture until they merged into one continuous darkness that pooled in the hollows and crept up the trunks of the walnut trees. The air had cooled enough that you could feel it on your cheeks, a faint, dry chill that carried the smell of wood smoke from a chimney somewhere down the Strasburg Road. The first evening fires of the season being lit in kitchens and parlors across the township. You pushed yourself off the doorframe and walked back into the barn, your boots sounding the same soft scuffs on the same packed earth that had been under you since before sunrise. The interior was now a landscape of deep shadow and fading gold, the high windows still holding a pale, watery light that reflected off the rafters and died before it reached the floor. The Conestoga wagon sat in the center of this dimness like a sleeping animal, its blue bedboards grayed by the dusk, its four wheels dark and silent, the oiled rims catching the last light as a series of faint, liquid gleams that moved when you moved. You went to the workbench and found the tin lantern hanging from its hook, the same lantern you had lit in the pre-dawn dark, the same lantern that had thrown its yellow circle on the left rear tire while the first robins sang. The glass was cool now, the oil reservoir still heavy with fuel, and you carried it to the wagon with the bail looped over 2 fingers, the lantern swinging gently with each step. You hung the lantern from the hound iron, the curved metal bar that braced the wagon tongue, a place where a lantern could ride through the night on the road ahead and cast enough light for the oxen to follow. The hound iron was cold under your fingers, rough with forged scale, and you hooked a bail over a notch that had been filed there years ago for exactly this purpose. Then you reached into your vest pocket and found a lucifer match, struck it against the iron itself with a quick, practiced flick, and touched the flame to the wick. The light bloomed upward, a small yellow teardrop that steadied into a soft, even glow, pushing the shadows back by a few feet and casting a warm circle on the packed earth and the wagon wheels and the lower edge of the blue bedboards. You adjusted the wick until the flame burned clean and smokeless, the glass warming slowly under your palm, and then you stepped back and let the lantern do its work. The final walk-around was a ritual you performed before every journey and after every day of preparation, a slow, methodical circuit of the wagon that asked nothing of your hands, but everything of your attention. You began at the left rear wheel, the same wheel you had first touched in the dark 12 hours ago, and you let your fingers trail over the oiled tire with a pressure so light that you might have been stroking the flank of a horse. The iron was cool now, the warmth of the afternoon long gone, and the linseed oil had dried to a thin, hard skin that felt smooth and faintly waxy under your fingertips, a surface that water would bead on and roll away. You traced the full circle of the tire from the ground up and around, your fingers passing over the burnished patches in the forge scale and the rivet heads with the same unhurried attention, feeling for any roughness that had not been there before, any new crack or shift that the day might have revealed. The iron was silent under your touch, a continuous, unbroken curve that spoke of sound metal and tight joinery, and a winter survived without harm. You moved to the right rear wheel, the one that carried the patch strap, and you spent a little longer here, your fingers finding the edge of the repair where the new iron met the old, feeling the smooth transition that the linseed oil had blended into near invisibility. The copper rivets were cool and slick, their domed heads a slight relief under your fingertips, and you pressed each one in turn the way you had pressed the rivets on the tire. Overlaps that morning. A quiet greeting that acknowledged the work you had done and the journey the patch would share. The wheel felt whole, the crack sealed and stilled, and you gave the tire a soft pat with your palm before moving on. The front wheels were next, the left one first, then the right, and you repeated the same trailing touch on each tire, your fingers reading the iron the way a blind man reads a face. The slight low spot on the right front rim from the worn brake shoe, the tighter curve of the smaller diameter, the polished silver of the high spots that had borne the most weight on the turnpike last fall. The hubs, when you knelt to touch them, were cool and dark. The fresh grease you had packed that morning now settled into an even, glossy ring around each axle entry, the wood of the hub bodies smooth and dry, the iron bands still tight, everything as it should be. You rose from your kneeling and dusted your hands on your trousers, the motion automatic, and you stood for a moment with the lantern light flickering across your boots, while the barn settled around you into its nighttime quiet. You walked to the front of the wagon and checked the tongue, running your hand along the hickory pole from the hound iron to the tip, feeling for any split or crack that the dry winter might have opened. The wood was smooth and solid, its surface polished by the friction of many yoke straps and the grip of many hands, and it flexed just slightly under your weight when you leaned on it, a healthy spring that meant the hickory still held its strength. The iron fittings that capped the tongue were tight, their rivets unloosened, and the ring at the tip that would take the oxen's chain was free of rust and swung easily on its pin. You walked back along the wagon's left side, trailing your fingers over the blue bedboards, feeling the grain of the poplar beneath the paint, the slight unevenness where two boards butted together, the iron staple that held the canvas cover's rope when the cover was raised. The bed was empty now, its interior a dark hollow that smelled of dry wood and old journeys, but tomorrow it would fill with the carefully packed belongings of the families heading west. The flour barrels and the salt pork casks and the feather beds and the plowshares, all the dense, necessary cargo of a new life. You rested your hand on the sideboard for a moment, looking into that empty space, and you thought of the miles ahead without urgency or worry, simply acknowledging that the wagon was ready, and the load would come and the road would unroll beneath the wheels like a long, slow ribbon. The walk-around was complete, and you returned to the lantern that hung from the hound iron, its flame still burning steady and clean, its glass now warm enough to take the chill from your fingers when you held your hands near it. You reached into your coat pocket and found your pipe, a simple thing of cherrywood and clay with a stem worn thin at the bit from years of gentle clenching, and the leather pouch of tobacco that you kept in your other pocket, the leaf dried and rubbed to a coarse, dark shred that smelled of honey and earth. You filled the pipe slowly, tamping the tobacco down with your thumb in 3 soft presses, the motion as familiar as the tapping of the hammer, and then you leaned down to the lantern and lifted the glass chimney, just enough to touch the pipe bowl to the flame. The tobacco caught with a small, bright crackle, and you drew on the stem until the ember glowed a steady, deep red, and the first mouthful of smoke filled your lungs, warm and rich, the taste settling on your tongue like a memory of other evenings before other journeys. You straightened the chimney and let the glass fall back into place, and then you stood beside the wagon with your shoulder against the front wheel hub, the pipe clenched lightly in your teeth, the smoke curling upward from the bowl in a thin, blue-grey ribbon that caught the lantern light and twisted toward the rafters. The barn swallows had gone to roost somewhere outside, and the wren had stopped singing, and the only sounds now were the soft hiss of the lantern flame and the occasional creak of a rafter as the day's warmth left the wood. You watched the smoke rise and spread and disappear into the high shadows, and you felt the tiredness of the day settle into your body with a heaviness that was not unpleasant, but simply present, a part of the evening, a part of the ritual. Through the open barn door, the world outside had darkened to a deep velvety blue, the last light of dusk fading in the west like a coal-going cold. The pasture was a soft, shapeless darkness now, the sorrel mare and the bay gelding having been led into the stable for the night, and the split-rail fence was a faint, broken line against the deeper black of the walnut trees. You stood where you could see through the doorway, and you watched the first fireflies of the season blink on and off in the yard, their tiny green-white lights winking in the grass and along the fence row, each one a brief silent pulse that appeared and disappeared without pattern, writing a secret, luminous script on the darkness. You had seen fireflies every spring of your life, and they had never stopped feeling like a small, quiet gift, a reminder that the world was alive and moving even in the stillest hours. The pipe burned down slowly, the tobacco turning to fine white ash, and you tapped the bowl against the heel of your boot until the ash fell out in a soft, grey shower that disappeared into the chaff on the barn floor. You stowed the pipe in your coat pocket, the cherry wood still warm against your chest, and you stood for a final moment with your hand resting on the wagon's front wheel, the iron tire cool and solid under your palm, the spokes radiating outward into the darkness like the ribs of a great, sleeping beast. The wheels had carried the wagon over turnpikes and through fords and across the rocky tracks of the Alleghenies, and they would carry it again, and you had done everything you could to make them ready, every tap and every measurement and every smear of grease and oil, a small, careful act of preparation that would be repaid in miles. You turned from the wagon and looked toward the farmhouse, and through the barn door you could see the kitchen windows glowing across the grass, two squares of warm amber light that seemed to float in the darkness like larger, steadier fireflies. The light was the color of the oil lamp that hung over the kitchen table, and you knew without being there that the table was set for supper, that the bread was cooling on the window-sill, that the kettle was singing on the stove. The sight of those windows, after a full day of work in the cold barn, pulled at something in your chest with a gentle, steady gravity, and you knew it was time to close up and go in. You took the lantern from the hound iron, the bale warm now where the flame had heated it, and you carried it to the open doorway, holding it high so that its light fell across the packed earth threshold and the grass beyond. You stepped outside and turned to face the barn, your boots sinking slightly into the soft April ground, the dew already beginning to gather on the blades of grass that bent under your weight. The sliding door was still open, the same narrow width you had left it at dawn, and you placed your hands on the wooden rail and leaned your weight into the slide, pulling it shut with one long slow motion that made the rollers rumble in their iron track. The door closed with a soft thump against the frame, and the darkness inside the barn became complete, the wagon and the tools and the spare rims and the straw all vanishing into a single, deep, quiet black. You reached for the latch, a simple iron bar that dropped into a staple on the doorframe, and you lifted it with your thumb and let it fall. The latch dropped with a soft iron clink, a sound so small and final that it might have been the period at the end of a long, careful sentence. You stood for a moment with your hand still on the latch, the lantern light flickering across the stone wall beside you, the fireflies still blinking in the yard, the kitchen windows still glowing warm across the grass, and you felt the stillness of the night settle over the farm like a blanket being drawn up to a chin. You turned toward the farmhouse and began to walk, the lantern swinging at your side, its light bobbing ahead of you in a small yellow circle that illuminated the path one step at a time. The grass was damp under your boots, the dew already soaking into the leather, and the air smelled of turned earth and wood smoke, and the faint green sweetness of new leaves unfurling somewhere in the dark. The kitchen door was a rectangle of warm light ahead of you, growing larger with each step, and you could see the silhouette of someone moving inside, a slow, familiar shape that passed the window and paused and passed again. Behind you, the barn was a dark, silent shape against the darker sky, its stone walls holding the day's work and the wagon and the four wheels that stood ready in the profound stillness. The iron rims would be cold now, the oil would be drying to its hard protective skin. The hubs would be holding their reservoirs of fresh grease, and the patch strap would be sitting tight against its rivets, all of it waiting for the first turn of the wheels, the first jingle of the trace chains, the first creak of the axles as the wagon rolled out of the barn and onto the Strasbourg road. But that was for tomorrow, when the families would gather and the oxen would be yoked and the long, slow trek west would begin. Tonight, there was only the quiet, the fireflies, the kitchen light, and the steady, unhurried sound of your boots on the path, carrying you home.